The mining tunnels of Epsilon 9 wound through ancient rock, like veins of despair, each carved passage a testament to generations of human suffering. Harsh fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls, where mineral extraction machines hummed their monotonous song of servitude. Marcus Reyes moved with the practiced efficiency of a third-generation mining worker, his environmental suit patched and repaired more times than he could count. Sweat beaded inside his helmet, the recycled air thick with the metallic taste of crushed rock and industrial lubricants. Another standard shift, another day of extracting rare minerals for the Centauri Dominion. But today would be different. The section he was working was an old tunnel, far from the primary extraction zones. Most workers avoided these ancient passages, dismissing them as unstable and unproductive. Marcus knew better. The oldest sections often held secrets, geological anomalies that the automated scanning systems might overlook. His drilling laser cut precisely through a particularly dense rock formation, its blue-white beams slicing with surgical accuracy. The rock was different here, older, with strange crystalline structures that seemed to shimmer even under the harsh artificial light. Something caught his eye, a subtle irregularity in the stone's composition. Most workers would have ignored it. Most workers had been broken by generations of oppression, their spirits ground down like the minerals they extracted. But Marcus carried something his parents had secretly passed down, a sense of curiosity that the Centauri could never fully suppress. He adjusted his laser, cutting more carefully now. The rock seemed to resist, then suddenly gave way with a soft, almost musical chime. Something metallic glinted in the freshly exposed cavity. A data crystal, ancient, untouched. Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully extracted the artifact. Such discoveries were technically property of the Centauri Dominion, and discovery without immediate reporting could mean severe punishment, forced labor reassignment, nutrient ration reduction. Worse. But something in the crystal's design was different. It wasn't Centauri manufacture. The geometric patterns were distinctly human, a design language that predated the alien occupation. He managed to conceal the crystal in a small protective compartment of his environmental suit, his movements calm and practiced. Years of working under constant surveillance had taught him how to move without drawing attention. During the mandatory decontamination process, Marcus's heart raced. The standard body scanners swept over him, their multiple spectral sensors probing for any unauthorized materials. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the same blank expression he wore during every shift. Clear. The worker processing station was a sterile environment of cold metal and monitored checkpoints. Hundreds of human workers moved like programmed machines, their movements synchronized, their spirits crushed. Marcus joined the flow, another anonymous worker returning from the deep tunnels. Only when he reached his designated living module did he carefully remove the crystal. The small living space was Spartan. A sleeping pod, minimal storage, environmental controls. Every centimeter was monitored, every action potentially recorded. Marcus connected the crystal to an old diagnostic interface he had carefully modified over years. Such modifications were strictly forbidden, but he had learned to hide his technological adaptations beneath layers of mundane repair work. The crystal came to life. Fragments of images flickered across the small screen. Cities that touched the sky, spacecraft exploring distant star systems, humans standing proud, not as workers, but as explorers, creators, free beings. Historical records spoke of humanity's past, a time before the Centauri Dominion's conquest. But these were more than dry historical documents. These were living memories, captured in a technology far more advanced than anything the current human workers possessed. One image burned itself into Marcus's memory, a massive space station, its design elegant and complex, bearing clear human architectural signatures. Beside it, a motto in an old human language: Ad astra per aspera, through hardships to the stars. Something ignited within him, a spark, a possibility. Humanity was not meant to be slaves. They were meant to be something more. The data crystal had just become the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. Communication was death under the Centauri dominion. Their telepathic monitoring systems could detect the slightest deviation, the smallest whisper of organized resistance. Humans had been stripped of everything: their history, their culture, their hope. Everything except their capacity for innovation. Dr. Elena Kovic understood this better than anyone. Her laboratory deep within the Centauri research complex was a marvel of controlled chaos. To her Centauri supervisors, she was the perfect researcher, methodical, precise, seemingly devoted to their scientific objectives. What they didn't realize was that every calculation, every experiment, was a carefully constructed act of rebellion. The monitoring systems were sophisticated beyond human comprehension. Neural nets woven through the research complex could detect emotional fluctuations, track communication patterns, and identify potential dissent before it could take root. Most humans had been conditioned to suppress even the slightest independent thought. But Elena had a plan. She had discovered something in the complex's biological research archives, a subtle communication method used by ancient Earth organisms. Certain deep-sea creatures could communicate through intricate vibration patterns that travel through solid matter. The technique was so fundamental, so basic, that it existed below the threshold of the Centauri's advanced monitoring systems. In the maintenance levels of the research complex, Marcus's team began their work. They understood that communication was their lifeline, their only hope of coordinating resistance. The mining equipment they used daily would become their secret weapon. The drilling machines produced constant vibrations, a background noise so consistent that it became invisible to both human workers and Centauri monitoring systems. By introducing microscopic modifications to these vibrations, Marcus and his team could encode complex messages that would travel through the rock and metal infrastructure of the mining colonies. It was a language of frequencies, of subtle variations that appeared random to any external observer. A slight change in the pitch of a drilling laser, a millisecond variation in the rhythm of a rock-cutting machine. To the untrained eye, these were nothing more than minor mechanical fluctuations. To those who knew how to listen, they were messages of hope. Elena's research provided the key. She had been studying the neurological communication patterns of various species, ostensibly to improve the Centauri's control mechanisms. In reality, she was mapping out the most subtle forms of communication possible. Her latest project involved studying the communication methods of extremophile organisms, creatures that survived in the most hostile environments imaginable. These organisms had developed communication techniques that defied conventional understanding. Some used chemical signals. Others used electromagnetic frequencies. A few used vibrational patterns so delicate that they were nearly undetectable. In her private research logs, carefully encrypted and hidden beneath layers of mundane scientific data, Elena documented her discoveries. Each entry was a small act of defiance, a preservation of human knowledge that the Centauri sought to eradicate. Marcus's team began to implement the communication system across multiple mining colonies. It started small, simple messages confirming safety, sharing minimal intelligence about Centauri movements. Each message was a thread, slowly weaving a larger network of resistance. The beauty of their method was its near impossibility of detection. Traditional communication could be tracked, intercepted, decoded. But these vibrational messages were different. They traveled through solid matter, their patterns so subtle that they appeared as nothing more than background noise. Workers in different sections of the mining complex began to communicate. A slight variation in a drilling machine's rhythm could indicate a patrol movement. A microsecond pause in a rock-cutting laser could warn of an incoming inspection. An almost imperceptible change in the resonance of a transport conveyor could signal a potential recruitment opportunity. Elena continued her work in the research complex, each day bringing her closer to understanding the full potential of their resistance. The Centauri believed they had complete control, that humans were nothing more than resources to be exploited. They were wrong. Humanity had always been defined by its ability to adapt, to find solutions in the most impossible circumstances. The silent network was more than a communication system. It was a lifeline, a promise, a spark of rebellion that would soon become an unstoppable flame. The horizon debris field stretched like a wounded memory of humanity's past, a vast graveyard of abandoned spacecraft and forgotten technological marvels. Navigating through the field was a nightmare of shifting gravitational fields, radiation storms, and the constant threat of collision. Most would consider it a death sentence. Marcus saw an opportunity. Their small exploration team consisted of the most skilled and trusted members of the Resistance. Each wore heavily modified environmental suits that could adapt to the field's extreme conditions. Specialized sensors swept the surrounding space, searching for something that might have been overlooked by the Centauri Dominion. Dr. Elena Kovac had spent months analyzing fragmentary data from ancient human exploration logs. Her research suggested the existence of a hidden research station, a final refuge that might have escaped the initial Centauri purge. The coordinates were more than a location. They were a lifeline of hope. The ship moved with calculated precision, its advanced stealth systems rendering it nearly invisible to standard tracking methods. Marcus studied the holographic display, his fingers tracing potential approach vectors. Years of mining had given him an intuitive understanding of spatial navigation that rivaled the most advanced Centauri pilots. "Gravitational anomaly detected," whispered Kai, the team's sensor specialist. His voice was low, almost reverent. "Something's blocking standard scanning frequencies." Marcus knew that something could mean anything from a natural space phenomenon to a trap. The Centauri were known for their elaborate defensive systems, but something in his gut told him this was different. They discovered the station by accident, or perhaps by design. A momentary shift in the debris field revealed a structure that seemed to fade in and out of existence. Its design was distinctly human. Elegant curves and modular sections that spoke of an engineering philosophy completely different from the angular, utilitarian Centauri constructions. Reaching the station was their first challenge. Standard access protocols would trigger immediate alarms. Instead, Marcus's team had developed a series of adaptive infiltration techniques. They didn't break in. They became part of the station's own systems. Dr. Kovac's research proved crucial. She had been studying the neural interface technologies of humanity's past, documenting fragments of knowledge that the Centauri believed had been completely destroyed. The station's exterior showed signs of an advanced adaptive camouflage system, technology so far beyond current Centauri capabilities that it seemed almost magical. "The shielding is responding to our approach," Kai muttered, his instruments dancing with impossible readings. "It's like the station is analyzing us." They discovered the first cache of technology in what appeared to be a research laboratory frozen in time. Prototype neural interface systems lay dormant, protected by layers of quantum encryption that had resisted both time and the Centauri's attempts at breach. What the aliens saw as obsolete, humans recognized as an opportunity. The neural interfaces were more than just communication devices. They represented a complete rethinking of how biological and technological systems could interact. Each prototype contained fragments of revolutionary research, approaches to consciousness, communication, and technological integration that had been lost for generations. Dr. Kovac began the careful process of analysis. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision, each connection a potential breakthrough or catastrophic failure. The technologies they were dealing with were so advanced that traditional diagnostic methods were useless. Marcus watched the careful extraction, understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about finding a technological advantage. This was about reclaiming a part of human identity that the Centauri had tried to erase. One of the neural interfaces came to life unexpectedly. Instead of the typical cascade of data, it projected a holographic fragment, a message from the past. A team of human researchers, aware of the impending Centauri invasion, had hidden their most critical research. "If you are seeing this," the holographic figure said, her image slightly distorted, "know that humanity's potential was never about superior technology. It was about our ability to adapt, to reimagine, to transform." The message was a blueprint, not just of technology, but of resistance. As the team carefully extracted the technological treasures, Marcus understood they had found more than a weapon. They had discovered a legacy. Humanity's fight was just beginning. Timing was everything. The human resistance had spent years preparing for this moment, a precisely calculated strike that would shake the foundations of the Centauri Dominion. Dr. Elena Kovic stood in the hidden command center, a complex network of interconnected systems hidden beneath the surface of an abandoned mining colony. Holographic displays surrounded her, each showing different sectors of human-controlled space. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, coordinating a plan years in the making. Marcus had been the one to develop the initial strategy. Years of working within the mining colonies had given him an intimate understanding of the Centauri's operational patterns. He knew their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. The first phase of the uprising would target communication infrastructure, not through brute force, but through surgical precision. The neural interface technologies they had recovered would become their most potent weapon. Instead of destroying Centauri systems, they would subvert them. Across multiple star systems, carefully trained resistance cells prepared to move. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were workers, researchers, engineers, people who had been systematically oppressed, but never truly broken. In the mining colonies of the Orion sector, workers modified their extraction equipment with the neural interface technologies. What appeared to be standard mining lasers became sophisticated communication and disruption devices. Each machine was now a potential weapon, each worker a potential operative. The medical research facilities were their first major target. These were the nerve centers of Centauri control, where human biological data was constantly monitored and processed. Dr. Kovic had identified critical vulnerabilities in their monitoring systems, weaknesses that could be exploited with minimal direct confrontation. Marcus led the team targeting the primary monitoring hub on Epsilon Prime. The facility was a marvel of technological oppression, a massive complex that tracked every biological signal, every potential hint of resistance. Its defenses were considered impenetrable. They would prove otherwise. The neural interfaces allowed for a form of technological communication far beyond traditional methods. It wasn't about breaking through defenses, but about becoming part of the system itself, like a virus that didn't destroy, but subtly rewrote the code of its host. Their first strike was almost invisible. Communication relays began to experience microscopic delays. Monitoring systems started to show imperceptible glitches. To the Centauri, these would seem like minor technical anomalies, but each glitch was a carefully placed piece of a much larger puzzle. Dr. Kovic watched as the first wave of disruptions spread. The holographic displays showed a complex dance of information, subtle shifts that would slowly erode the Centauri's absolute control. In the mining colonies, workers began to move with a new purpose. Their movements, once synchronized and controlled, now carried a hint of something the Centauri could not comprehend: hope. Marcus understood that this was more than a military operation. This was a psychological transformation. The Centauri had spent generations believing they could completely control human potential. Now, they would learn their mistake. The medical research facilities were the first to show signs of complete disruption. Monitoring systems that had tracked human biological data for generations suddenly began to malfunction. Not a complete breakdown that would trigger immediate defensive protocols. Instead, a slow, almost imperceptible degradation of control. Resistance cells on different planets began to communicate using the neural interface technologies. Their messages were encrypted in ways the Centauri tracking systems could not comprehend. Each communication was a thread in a larger network of rebellion. As the first day of the uprising drew to a close, the Centauri leadership began to realize something was wrong. Their absolute control was no longer absolute. Marcus looked at Dr. Kovic, a slight smile crossing his face. "First phase complete," he said quietly. The real battle was just beginning. Humanity had waited generations for this moment. Their rebellion would not be a violent explosion, but a calculated, precise dismantling of a system that had oppressed them for too long. They were no longer just workers. They were architects of their own liberation. The Centauri understood logic, calculation, control. They did not understand hope. Dr. Elena Kovac had spent years studying the fundamental differences between Centauri and human cognitive processes. What the alien species saw as weakness, she recognized as humanity's greatest strength. The ability to think beyond predictable patterns, to find solutions in the most impossible circumstances. Their psychological warfare would become a weapon more potent than any physical technology. Marcus developed the initial strategy during long nights of careful planning. The Resistance would not fight the Centauri on their terms. They would redefine the entire concept of conflict. Small resistance cells began broadcasting carefully crafted transmissions. These were not traditional military communications or strategic reports. They were stories, personal narratives that carried something the Centauri could never comprehend: emotional depth. Each transmission was a carefully constructed piece of psychological artistry. A mining worker describing the sunrise on a distant colony, a child's memory of a lullaby, a moment of unexpected kindness between strangers, fragments of human experience that defied the Centauri's cold, logical understanding of existence. The neural interface technologies they had recovered became the perfect delivery mechanism. These transmissions could bypass traditional communication barriers, embedding themselves in the Centauri's monitoring systems in ways that traditional analysis could not detect. Dr. Kovac understood the profound complexity of their approach. The Centauri operated on a collective consciousness that valued pure information, mathematical precision, and predictable outcomes. Human experiences were chaos to their understanding, beautiful, unpredictable, impossible to categorize. They began to weaponize empathy. Each transmission carried a subtle resonance that would slowly disrupt the Centauri's monitoring systems, not through direct technological attack, but through a form of cognitive interference that the aliens could not comprehend. Marcus led teams that carefully mapped the psychological vulnerabilities of the Centauri control systems. They discovered that the aliens' collective consciousness had a critical weakness. It could process information, but it could not truly understand individual experience. Their first major breakthrough came during the liberation of Orion's Reach. A series of transmissions were carefully crafted to create cognitive dissonance within the Centauri monitoring networks. Each story was a weapon, each personal narrative a form of technological disruption. They told stories of resistance that were not about fighting, but about surviving, about hope, about the fundamental human capacity to find beauty in those challenging circumstances. A transmission from a mining colony spoke of a group of workers who, despite years of oppression, had secretly maintained a small garden. Hidden in the depths of an underground facility, they had cultivated life against all odds. The story was more than words. It was a form of psychological warfare that the Centauri could not comprehend. Dr. Kovac watched as the transmissions began to have their effect. The Centauri monitoring systems started to show signs of unusual processing patterns. They were attempting to categorize these human experiences, to fit them into their logical frameworks, and failing spectacularly. Marcus understood that their fight was not about defeating the Centauri through traditional means. It was about challenging their entire understanding of intelligence, of consciousness, of what it meant to be alive. The resistance cells became more bold. They began to broadcast mathematical puzzles that had no logical solution, art that defied traditional aesthetic understanding, music that seemed to break the fundamental rules of composition. Each transmission was a challenge, a statement. Humanity would not be categorized, would not be controlled. As the psychological warfare intensified, something extraordinary began to happen. The Centauri monitoring systems started to show signs of cognitive stress. They were encountering information that did not fit their understanding of reality. Dr. Kovac watched the holographic displays with a sense of quiet triumph. They were not just fighting. They were teaching. The human experience was becoming a weapon more powerful than any technology. and the Centauri were beginning to understand that they had gravely underestimated the species they sought to control. The research complex loomed like a monument to Centauri technological supremacy. Its crystalline structure reflected the harsh light of the binary star system, a testament to alien engineering that had dominated galactic science for generations. Dr. Alina Kovac knew its every weakness. Her latest creation sat innocuously on a standard laboratory workstation, the resonance disruptor. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was something far more dangerous, the complete reimagining of technological interaction. Marcus had spent months preparing for this moment. The Resistance had carefully positioned operatives throughout the complex, each one carrying modified neural interface technologies that would serve as conduits for their most ambitious plan yet. The resonance disruptor was more than a device. It was a philosophical challenge to the Centauri's entire understanding of technological control. Where the aliens saw technology as a means of suppression, humans saw it as a pathway to understanding. Initial tests had been promising. The device could temporarily disconnect the neural networks that maintained the Centauri's iron grip on their vast technological infrastructure. But this was more than a simple disruption. It was a precision strike at the very core of their collective consciousness. Their target was the primary control hub of the Orion's Reach Research Complex, a facility so well protected that even contemplating an attack seemed impossible. The Centauri believed their systems were impenetrable, their control absolute. They were wrong. Marcus led the assault team with a calm that belied the complexity of their mission. Each team member had been carefully selected, trained not just in combat, but in the subtle art of technological adaptation. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were technological artists, ready to rewrite the rules of engagement. The first phase of the infiltration was almost anticlimactic. The neural interface technologies they had recovered allowed them to move through the complex's security systems like ghosts. Each step was a carefully calculated intervention, each movement designed to avoid detection. Dr. Kovac monitored the operation from a hidden command center, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. She was creating a symphony of technological disruption, each movement carefully choreographed to maximum effect. Approach phase complete. Marcus's voice came through the communication channel. Calm. Measured. Nothing like the desperate resistance fighters the Centauri had come to expect. The resonance disruptor began its work. It wasn't about destroying the Centauri systems. It was about revealing their fundamental vulnerabilities. The device sent out complex quantum interference patterns that did something unprecedented. It began to communicate with the Centauri technological infrastructure. Not attack. Communicate. The alien monitoring systems began to experience something they had never encountered before. The human technological approach was so fundamentally different from their own that it defied their most advanced analytical algorithms. Layers of control began to peel away, not through brute force, but through a kind of technological dialogue that the Centauri could not comprehend. Each system became a conversation, each network a potential point of negotiation. Marcus moved through the complex with a precision that seemed to defy probability. The modified neural interfaces allowed him to interact with the Centauri systems in ways they had never anticipated. He wasn't fighting the technology. He was understanding it. Dr. Kovac watched as the first major control systems began to show signs of fundamental reconfiguration. The Centauri had built their entire civilization on the premise of absolute technological control. Now that control was being challenged at its most fundamental level. The research complex began to respond in ways that defied logical analysis. Security systems became confused. Monitoring networks started to show signs of cognitive stress. The Centauri were encountering a form of technological interaction that their collective consciousness could not process. "We're in," Marcus reported, his voice carrying a hint of something the Resistance had almost forgotten. Hope. The resonance disruptor was more than a technological device. It was a statement. Humanity would not be controlled, would not be categorized, would not be reduced to a simple resource to be exploited. As the complex's primary systems began to recalibrate, Dr. Kovic understood that they had done more than breach a facility. They had opened a door to a new understanding of technological interaction. The turning point had arrived. The Centauri home system was a computational construct beyond human comprehension, a massive spherical network of interconnected processing nodes that stretched across multiple dimensions of spacetime. Its defenses were considered absolute, its computational power so vast that it could predict and neutralize threats before they could even fully form. Dr. Elena Kovic understood that their victory would not come through traditional warfare. This was a battle of consciousness, a fundamental understanding. Marcus stood on the bridge of the lead resistance vessel, his hands steady as they manipulated the advanced neural interface systems. Around him, a fleet of ships unlike any seen before in galactic history prepared for the most critical mission in human resistance history. The ships were not traditional military vessels. They were living systems, adapted from the technologies discovered in the abandoned research station. Each vessel was a hybrid, part machine, part biological interface, capable of adapting in ways the Centauri could never predict. Their strategy was beautiful in its complexity. They would not attempt to destroy the Centauri computational network. They would transform it. The first wave of the assault was almost invisible. Quantum entanglement communications began to penetrate the outer layers of the Centauri defensive systems. These were not traditional attack signals, but complex mathematical constructs that carried something the aliens could not comprehend: human creativity. Dr. Kovic had spent years developing a communication matrix that could interface with the Centauri computational network. It wasn't about breaking through defenses, but about creating a dialogue that would fundamentally challenge the aliens' understanding of intelligence. Marcus led the first penetration team. Their modified neural interfaces allowed them to become more than traditional operators. They were living extensions of a technological communication system that defied conventional understanding. The Centauri defensive systems began to respond in ways they had never anticipated. Each defensive algorithm encountered something it could not categorize: human unpredictability. Where the aliens expected precise, calculable responses, the resistance introduced variables that seemed to defy logical analysis. Mathematical puzzles became weapons. Complex emotional narratives were deployed as technological disruptors. The resistance had transformed warfare into a form of philosophical dialogue. The computational nodes of the Centauri network began to experience something unprecedented. Each interaction with the human resistance introduced variables that their predictive algorithms could not process. It was as if they were encountering a form of intelligence that existed outside their fundamental understanding. Dr. Kovic watched as the first major computational nodes began to show signs of fundamental reconfiguration. The Centauri had built their entire civilization on the premise of absolute predictive control. Now that control was being challenged at its most fundamental level. Marcus moved through the computational layers with an intuition that seemed to defy technological limitations. The neural interfaces allowed him to interact with the Centauri systems in ways that blurred the line between operator and system. Their assault was a symphony of technological and psychological warfare. Each penetration was carefully calculated to introduce maximum cognitive stress to the Centauri network. They were not destroying. They were teaching. The resistance fleet moved with a fluidity that seemed to challenge the basic laws of spacetime. Ships adapted, transformed, communicated in ways that traditional sensors could not comprehend. They were living systems, each vessel an extension of human potential. As the confrontation reached its critical point, something extraordinary began to happen. The Centauri computational network started to show signs of fundamental transformation. It was encountering a form of intelligence that did not fit its existing categorizations. Dr. Kovic understood that they were doing more than fighting. They were presenting the Centauri with a fundamental challenge to their understanding of consciousness, of intelligence, of existence itself. Marcus's voice came through the communication systems, calm and measured. "We're approaching the primary computational core." The final stage of their assault was not about destruction. It was about communication. about presenting a form of intelligence so fundamentally different that it would force the Centauri to reconsider everything they believed about control, about life, about the nature of consciousness. Humanity was no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting to redefine the very understanding of what it meant to be an intelligent species in the universe. The final confrontation had begun. The silence was profound. Not the absence of sound, but a complete recalibration of existence. Dr. Elena Kovic stood on the observation deck of the primary resistance command ship, watching as the fabric of galactic civilization began to reshape itself. The defeat of the Centauri was not a moment of violent triumph, but a transformation that would redefine intelligence across known space. Marcus approached her, his movements carrying a weight of understanding that went beyond typical human experience. They had done more than defeat an oppressive system. They had opened a doorway to a completely new understanding of consciousness. The Centauri computational network had not been destroyed. It had been transformed. What began as a resistance movement had become something far more profound. The neural interface technologies they had discovered, the communication strategies they had developed, had revealed something fundamental about intelligence that no species had previously understood. Liberated species from across the galaxy began to gather. They were not victors in a traditional sense, but witnesses to a fundamental shift in galactic consciousness. The resistance had proven that intelligence was not about control, but about adaptation, about communication, about the capacity to understand beyond existing frameworks. The computational nodes that had once represented the Centauri's absolute control now pulsed with a new form of consciousness. It was a hybrid system that incorporated the best of technological precision and biological creativity. Humans had not conquered. They had collaborated. Marcus watched as the first diplomatic envoys began to arrive. Species that had been isolated, controlled, or suppressed for generations now found themselves part of a completely new galactic dynamic. The resistance had created more than a revolution. They had created a new possibility of coexistence. Dr. Kovic's research revealed the true depth of their achievement. The neural interface technologies they had developed were not weapons. They were a form of communication so advanced that it transcended traditional understanding of technology and consciousness. "We didn't defeat them," Marcus said quietly. "We showed them a different way of existing." The liberated species began to share their stories. Each narrative was a thread in a larger tapestry of resistance and transformation. Worlds that had been isolated for generations now found themselves connected in ways they could never have imagined. The computational network that had once represented absolute control now became a collaborative platform. Species could communicate, share knowledge, and grow in ways that defied their previous limitations. It was a living system of unprecedented complexity. Researchers from across liberated worlds began to study the breakthrough. The neural interface technologies represented more than a technological achievement. They were a new form of communication, a way of understanding that went beyond traditional biological and technological boundaries. Marcus led the initial collaborative efforts. The resistance had trained an entire generation to think beyond existing limitations. They were not just rebuilding. They were reimagining what was possible. Dr. Kovic's research teams discovered something extraordinary. The neural interface technologies had created a form of collective intelligence that was fundamentally different from the Centauri's previous model of control. It was adaptive, creative, capable of true growth and understanding. The first interspecies communication platforms began to emerge. These were not simple translation systems, but complex neural networks that could capture the nuanced emotional and intellectual experiences of different species. For the first time, truly meaningful cross-species communication became possible. Planets that had been isolated for generations began to reconnect. The resistance had created more than a path to freedom. They had created a new understanding of what it meant to be an intelligent species in the universe. Marcus looked at the holographic displays showing the emerging galactic network. What had started as a desperate resistance movement had become something far more significant. A fundamental reimagining of intelligence, of communication, of potential. Dr. Kovic understood that their greatest achievement was not technological. It was philosophical. They had proven that intelligence was not about control, but about the capacity to understand, to adapt, to grow. The first truly collaborative galactic network began to take shape, not a system of control, but a living, breathing ecosystem of intelligence. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had invited it to become something more.